The night of 26th April 1944 is cold and clear on the northern coast of Crete. A black Opel staff car rolls westward along the coastal road between Arkans and Heraklion, its headlamps cutting twin pale ribbons through the darkness. Inside, General Heinrich Kreipe sits in the rear seat, his uniform immaculate, his knight's cross resting at his throat. He is a man of routine. Every evening, the same road, the same driver, the same rhythm of occupation. He has no reason to expect otherwise tonight. Then, at a bend in the road near the village of Knossos, two figures in German military police uniform step into the headlamp's beam. The driver slows. It is a checkpoint, or so it appears. One of the figures approaches the driver's side, and before Kreipe can process what is happening, the door is wrenched open, the driver is hauled out and subdued, and a pistol is pressed firmly against the general's temple. The voice that speaks to him is low, assured, unmistakably British. It informs him, with a politeness that borders on the surreal, that he is now a prisoner of the British Army. The most senior German officer on the island of Crete has been taken from the back of his own staff car in the space of 30 seconds. What follows is one of the most audacious special operations of the Second World War, a mission that drove an Opel carrying a kidnapped German general through 22 enemy checkpoints, across the highest mountains in Crete, and ultimately out of the island entirely. It was conceived in Cairo, executed by two young British officers and a band of Cretan partisans, and it sent a tremor of disbelief and rage through the German high command that would echo all the way to Hitler's headquarters. It was not a battle. No artillery was fired, no bridgehead was seized. But in terms of pure psychological audacity, Operation Kreipe stands entirely alone. To understand how such an operation came to be planned at all, one must understand the state of Crete by early 1944. The island had fallen to Germany in May 1941, following the Battle of Crete, one of the most costly airborne operations in history. Germany's elite Fallschirmjäger had taken the island, but only at staggering cost. Some 3,764 killed and over 2,500 wounded in a single week of fighting. Hitler, horrified by the losses, resolved never again to use mass parachute assault. Crete was occupied, but the occupation was brutal, expensive, and never truly secure. The island's mountainous interior, dominated by the White Mountains in the west and the Ida Massif in the center, provided natural refuge for resistance fighters and SOE-supported partisan bands who maintained a constant, grinding insurgency. German reprisals were savage and indiscriminate. Entire villages were destroyed. Hundreds of civilians were executed in collective punishment operations. And yet, the resistance endured. By 1944, the German garrison on Crete numbered approximately 75,000 men, an enormous commitment of men and material to an island whose strategic relevance had diminished substantially following the Allied campaigns in North Africa and the invasion of Italy. The garrison was effectively pinned in place, too large to withdraw without catastrophic loss of prestige, too exposed to redeploy. The occupation had become a war of attrition, and Germany was losing it slowly, village by village, ambush by ambush, on the rocky slopes of mountains that their maps could name, but their soldiers could never truly control. Into this environment, the Special Operations Executive had been inserting agents since 1941. These were not conventional soldiers. They were academics, linguists, and adventurers, men who moved through the Cretan hills in the clothing of shepherds, sleeping in caves, sustained by the extraordinary courage of the ordinary Cretan people who sheltered them at mortal risk. The most prominent among them was Patrick Lee Fermor, then 29 years old, a man of astonishing intellectual breadth and physical hardiness, who had already spent years in Crete and spoke the language with native fluency. He was, by any measure, precisely the sort of person the British establishment pretended not to produce but quietly relied upon in extremis. Lee Fermor had conceived the idea of kidnapping a German general as a demonstration of reach, a statement delivered not in words, but in the sudden, humiliating absence of one of the Reich's own commanders. The mission had a clear strategic intent: to undermine German confidence in the security of their own senior officers, to boost the morale of the Cretan resistance, and to demonstrate to the occupied population that the British presence on the island was active, capable, and unafraid. The choice of target was made for them by circumstance. General Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, the man originally intended for abduction, had already left the island by the time the operation was ready to launch. His replacement, General Heinrich Kreipe, who had assumed command of the 22nd Infantry Division in February 1944, had served on the Eastern Front and carried the professional credentials of a senior Wehrmacht officer. He would do. The mission team assembled under Lee Fermor consisted of himself and his fellow SOE officer, Captain William Stanley Moss, 23 years old and possessed of an almost theatrical self-confidence, together with a group of Cretan partisans whose knowledge of the island's terrain and population was irreplaceable. Moss and Lee Fermor had studied Kreipe's movements with forensic patience, observing his daily routines from concealed positions over several weeks. They knew the route, they knew the time, they knew the car. They had fashioned 2 sets of German military police uniforms from materials obtained on the island. They had prepared handcuffs. They had rehearsed the scenario with the kind of particular attention to detail that only those who fully understand the consequences of failure tend to apply. On the night of the ambush, the plan worked with a precision that even its architects might have found difficult to believe in the abstract. The car was stopped, Kreipe was subdued, and Lee Fermor himself slid into the driver's seat wearing a German cap. Moss sat beside Kreipe in the rear, pressing a weapon into the general's ribs. The Cretan partisans who had been waiting in the roadside vegetation melted back into the night. The Opel continued westward toward Heraklion, with 3 of its occupants changed, and one of them very much against his will. The drive through the outskirts of Heraklion is the point at which the operation entered the realm of the genuinely extraordinary. Lee Fermor drove Kreipe's own car, carrying Kreipe's own flags, and bearing Kreipe's own identification plates, through the checkpoint after checkpoint that controlled access to and from the city. At each one, he slowed, maintained composure, acknowledged the salutes with appropriate authority, and drove on. 22 separate checkpoints were negotiated in this fashion. Kreipe, seated in the rear with Moss's gun at his side, was instructed to remain still and silent. He complied, whether from shock, pragmatic calculation, or simple professional assessment of his odds. The general of the 22nd Infantry Division sat in his own kidnapped car and watched the island's garrison salute him as he was driven to captivity. The car was eventually abandoned on the road to Rethymnon, where the team left a British commando beret and a letter addressed to the German authorities explaining that the general had been taken by British forces and that the Cretan population bore absolutely no responsibility for the action. This was a calculated and compassionate gesture. Lee Fermor was acutely aware that German reprisals against civilians had been the response to every previous act of resistance. The letter was intended to absorb the coming fury and direct it where it belonged, at the British, who were out of reach. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. What followed the kidnap was a crossing of the Ida Massif that tested every member of the group to the edges of their endurance. The team, now numbering Lee Fermor, Moss, their Cretan guides, and a general who was at once their prisoner and their most critical liability, spent 18 days moving across the mountains toward the southern coast. The terrain was savage. The White Mountains and the high slopes of Mount Ida, Siluritis, the highest point in Crete at 2,456 meters, offered refuge but demanded an extraordinary physical toll. The party moved at night wherever possible, sheltered in caves and stone shepherds' huts, sustained by food brought up through the partisan network. German search parties scoured the northern lowlands. Aircraft flew grid patterns over the hills. Roadblocks were established across every significant route. There is an account, well documented and attested to by both Lee Fermor and Kreipe himself, of a moment on those mountain slopes that has since passed into the literature of the war, with something approaching the quality of myth. As dawn broke over the heights of Mount Ida, Kreipe gazed at the summit and murmured the opening lines of Horace's Ninth Ode, a Latin poem about Mount Soracte under snow. Lee Fermor, recognizing the lines, completed the verse from memory. The two men stared at each other across the chasm of war and occupation and found, for a moment, that they had once read the same books. Kreipe said quietly that they had not much in common, but that they shared this. It was not a scene that any dramatist would have dared to write. But it happened, on a mountainside in Crete, in the spring of 1944, between a British intelligence officer and his German prisoner, with 100,000 enemy soldiers searching the island below them. The evacuation was arranged through SOE's Cairo headquarters. A motor launch arrived at a point on the southern coast near Rodakino in the early hours of 14th May 1944. The general was taken aboard and transported to Egypt. He spent the remainder of the war in British captivity, eventually ending up at a prisoner of war facility in Canada. He was treated, by all documented accounts, with the courtesy that British officers considered appropriate for a prisoner of equivalent rank. He was not mistreated. He was fed. He was housed. He was, by the standards of the war being fought around him, fortunate. The German response on the island was immediate and furious. The Luftwaffe intensified its aerial searches. Ground forces swept through villages and interrogated hundreds of people. But the network that had sheltered and supported the operation was too deep, too well embedded in the population, and too practiced in concealment to be meaningfully penetrated. The reprisals, when they came, fell on communities that genuinely knew nothing. The letter left in Kreipe's car had been dismissed by German intelligence as a propaganda device, and the occupation authorities moved forward on the assumption that local partisans must have played a central operational role. Their assumptions were professionally understandable, but factually wrong. It is instructive to compare Operation Kreipe with German and American approaches to equivalent problems. The Germans were not strangers to unconventional operations. SS Sturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny rescue of Mussolini from the Gran Sasso in September 1943 remains the most famous special operations mission of the war, and it was genuinely spectacular in its execution. But Skorzeny's mission was a rescue, not a kidnap, and it relied on gliders, full air transport coordination, and the element of surprise in a static location where the target was already confined. Operation Kreipe required weeks of patient observation, a sustained improvised logistics network across occupied territory, the cooperation of a civilian population under active German surveillance, and a 19-day movement through hostile mountain terrain with a captive general in tow. The operational complexity is different in kind, not merely degree. The Americans, operating through the Office of Strategic Services, were developing their own capacity for deep penetration operations in occupied Europe by this period, but had not attempted anything of comparable character in the Mediterranean theatre. Allied special operations in France through the SOE's F section were focused primarily on sabotage and resistance support, rather than the capture of individual commanders. The Kreipe operation was, in that sense, genuinely without precedent in British or Allied operational history. The psychological impact on the German garrison was significant and documentable. Senior officers who had been living with the comfortable assumption that their staff cars and scheduled movements placed them in a category of reliable safety were forced to revise that assumption. Security arrangements around German commanders on the island were substantially tightened. The knowledge that two British officers had driven a kidnapped general through 22 checkpoints in the man's own car, using his own identification, whilst the entire garrison saluted, produced a very particular kind of institutional unease. It was not the fear of military defeat. It was something older and more corrosive, the suspicion that no routine was secure, no identity unquestionable, no assumption of control genuinely warranted. The Cretan population understood the operation in entirely different terms. For a people who had been subjected to 3 years of systematic occupation, collective punishment, and the daily humiliation of seeing the swastika flying over their ancient island, the news that a British officer had driven the German divisional commander through Heraklion in his own car, and then walked him over a mountain, carried a symbolism that no military communiqué could have matched. Resistance organizations reported a significant uplift in recruitment and in the confidence with which they operated in the months following the Kreipe abduction. Exact numbers are difficult to verify. The partisan records of this period are fragmentary, and their accuracy varies considerably. But the qualitative evidence is consistent across multiple independent sources. The island was changed in some unmeasurable but real way by the knowledge of what had been done. The operation's influence on later special operations doctrine is harder to trace with precision, as so much of the planning and assessment work remained classified for decades after the war. What can be said with confidence is that the principles it demonstrated, minimal force, patient preparation, exploitation of the enemy's own structures against him, the use of a civilian support network as both intelligence asset and logistics capability, became central to British special operations philosophy as it developed through the latter decades of the 20th century. The SAS, formally established in 1942, was already building a tradition of deep penetration operations, and the lessons of Crete fed into a body of institutional knowledge that informed British unconventional warfare doctrine for a generation. General Kreipe himself later said, in a post-war interview, that the operation had been conducted with complete professionalism and that his captors had behaved throughout their weeks together in the mountains with conspicuous honor. Surviving documentation from the operation is held primarily in the National Archives at Kew. Lee Firmer's own account, written with characteristic literary grace, is available in edited form. Moss published his memoir, Ill Met by Moonlight, in 1950, and it was adapted into a film by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger in 1957, with Dirk Bogarde playing Lee Firmer. The film is fine, and Bogarde is magnetic, but those who read Moss's account first will find the screen version a necessarily compressed and simplified rendering of an operation whose power lay precisely in its slowness, its patience, and its weeks of unglamorous endurance among the rocks and cold springs of the Cretan mountains. A replica of Kreipe's staff car can be found in the War Museum in Heraklion, where it stands as perhaps the most improbable war trophy in any collection anywhere in the world. Return now to that April evening on the road near Knossos. The Opel staff car slows. The figures in German uniform step forward, and a general who is governed by the logic of overwhelming force discovers in the space of 30 seconds that the logic has changed. He is driven through his own garrison in his own car by men who have studied him for weeks and prepared for every contingency. He sits in darkness as checkpoint after checkpoint passes without incident, each saluting soldier a small confirmation that the architecture of occupation can be turned inside out by patience, nerve, and an understanding of the enemy's own habits. The mountains above Crete hold the cold of those April nights still in their stone. Somewhere above the cloud line, where the Cretan partisans once moved in silence between snow-filled gullies, The landscape is unchanged. The roads below are different now. The checkpoints are gone. The swastika does not fly. But the story endures, not because it shortened the war by a measurable degree or altered the disposition of a single division, but because it demonstrated something about the reach of the human imagination under extreme pressure. The capacity to look at a situation that appears completely controlled and find, with sufficient ingenuity and sufficient nerve, the single point at which it is not. Two men in borrowed uniforms, a general in handcuffs, a car driving through the dark. It is, in the end, one of the purest stories the Second World War produced. And it happened, every detail of it, on an island that the Germans thought they owned.